Hello everybody, it's me again, and I've accepted the fact that the shelves in the background will never look good or remotely straight. And I'm sorry about the lighting, which seems to be flickering at the moment, but my last name is not Sorrentino and this is not the Great Beauty, okay? So get over it. I thought I would talk about Italian books today, especially books that are considered modern classics, because I'm tired of seeing Elena Ferrante everywhere, even though I think she's a really good writer and I was obsessed with the Brilliant Friend novels and I can't wait to watch the TV series, but there's plenty more where that came from. And I'm not going to talk about Calvino because everybody knows him and because I'm not that crazy about him, to be honest. The first author I want to talk about is Dino Buzzati. Buzzati was a novelist, a short story writer, a painter, a poet, as well as a journalist, and was active from the 1930s until his death in 1972. His fiction is basically characterized by a heavy surrealism and magical realism, and in this sense is often referred to as the Italian Kafka. I also saw an interview the other day, I think from 1962, where this journalist called Buzzati a man coming from the year 2000, and I think that's very apt because he was very ahead of his time, especially in his paintings that he called painted stories, because the canvas would be divided into squares like in comics, and he would add speech balloons or text descriptions as well. After the war, he will mainly write articles about cronaca nera, which literally means black chronicle. So we're talking about newspaper columns about murders and daily tragedies in Italy. So it's easy to see how that professional background will influence his themes in his fiction, which is very bleak and filled with death. So you want to be careful when you pick him up. His most famous novel is The Tartar Steppe, published in 1940. The novel tells the story of Giovanni Drogo, a young officer who basically spends his whole life guarding this desolate fortress in the middle of the desert on the border with the land of the Tartars. So Giovanni and his comrades wait for this great war that will finally give their lives a meaning and make all the years they sacrificed worth it. I won't go into detail, but there's a lot of Beckett and Kafka in here, so if you like this sort of thing, you should check this out. I want to talk a bit more about Buzzati because he definitely deserves it, and because he was more known as a short story writer. And it turns out that finally, this year in March, one of his collections was published or reprinted, I'm not sure, by Echo Press. The collection is called Catastrophe and Other Stories, and it's translated by Judith Landry. As for his novel, even his stories present a lot of echoes from Kafka, Edgar Allan Poe and Cortázar. One of the most famous stories which is featured on this book is Seven Floors, about a man who is hospitalized in this modern institution where the patients are assigned to a specific floor based on the seriousness of their illnesses. So you will find on the top floor the least dangerous cases, while on the bottom floor the terminal cases. So the protagonist of the story is allocated to the 7th floor because he's told he's going to recover very soon and his situation is not dangerous. But then for a series of bureaucratic incidents, it will have to move to the lower floor and then again to the lower floor until, well, you can guess how it ends. And it's very satirical and depressing. In another story, just the very thing they wanted, a couple of tourists end up in this town in northern Italy where they are treated with suspicion by the locals who refuse to give them a hotel room until they are persecuted and beat up by a crowd of angry people. So yeah, it's very grotesque but quite funny at the same time. A lot of people don't seem to like the fact that a lot of Buzzati's fiction is very short, more like flash fiction. So the reader is supposed to imagine what happens in the end. Next up we have Giorgio Bassani, who I think is quite famous because most of his fiction is published by Penguin. Bassani was a Jewish writer and poet who was active from the 1940s until the late 90s. And he became famous in 1956 when he published Cinque Storie Ferraresi. That means 5 stories from Ferrara. That's the town where he spent his childhood and teenage years. It's published as Within the Walls and it's translated by Jamie McKendrick. The book won the Strega Award, which is the most important literary prize for fiction in Italy. The stories are set after the Second World War, and among the characters we have a young woman who's just given birth to her first child but is abandoned by her lover and is forced to go back to live with her mother, a Jewish doctor, a Holocaust survivor, an old teacher who used to be a socialist activist, and a pharmacist who witnesses from his window the execution of 11 people in the middle of the street by the fascist regime. So it's definitely not a cheerful book you want to buy your friend for Christmas, but it's really interesting because it's the first of 6 books that comprise the cycle of the novel of Ferrara, which is going to be published, I think, for the first time in its entirety by Penguin next October. My favorite volumes are actually the second and the third, but by the way, they can be read separately because they're only loosely connected to each other. Obviously, Ferrara is the main character, and only a bunch of other characters will reappear more than once, but anyway, you don't need to read the whole thing. The most famous of the series is the third book, which is The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, which won another major prize the year it was published. It tells the story of this rich Jewish family from Ferrara that live in this huge villa surrounded by walls and gates. They have a tennis court and domestic servants. And beside the parents and a grandmother, there are 2 siblings who are homeschooled, and they are Alberto and Nicole. In 1938, after the racial laws are proclaimed by Mussolini, the young narrator of the story, which could be Bassani himself, is banished from his tennis club because he's a Jew. But he will be welcomed by the Finzi-Continis, who will host tennis games for their friends. So it's a tragic love story. It's basically like Call Me By Your Name, but with racial laws, Mussolini, and straight people. As I said, the second volume is another favorite, and it's The Gold-Rimmed Spectacles. Oh, by the way, they're all translated by Jamie McKendrick. The narrator of this story is a young Jewish student from the University of Bologna who tells the story of Athos Vadigati, the new doctor from Venice who just arrived in town, and who's famous for his culture and professional skills and for his alleged homosexuality. Every morning, Vadigati takes the train from Ferrara to Bologna, and he becomes friends with the narrator and the other boys who commute to university. And among the students, there's this despicable, self-centered boy who will use his charm to take advantage of the doctor for his selfish reasons. And once the racial laws are emanated and Vadigati's sexuality is recognized by everybody, he will become the victim of this changing society. So it's really tragic because that's what I like, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this. I plan on talking about at least 2 or 3 more authors in my next video, so please let me know in the comments if it's something you might be interested in, but I won't care because I'm going to post it anyway because it's my bloody channel, okay? I hope you have a great day. See you soon.